I'm Peggy Boyles, Director of Development for the Division of Student Affairs here at the university. And on behalf of the division and the Vice Provost for Student Affairs, Dean of Students, Danny Pugh, I want to welcome you all to the first Chester Johnson poetry reading. I met Chester in 2007, and during our conversation, the one thing that I left with was, out of all the schools that I've attended, I've never had a poetry reading at the University of Arkansas. So I thought, I think he may want to have a poetry reading at the University of Arkansas. It's been 3 years in the making, but it's here and not before time. And without further ado, I actually want to introduce Cedric Kenner, who is director of the Multicultural Center, this wonderful space that they're allowing us to use. And he's going to talk to you just very briefly about the Multicultural Center. And then we'll have Davis McCombs come up and introduce Chester for you. Thank you all for coming.
How's everyone doing? Great, great. On behalf of the Multicultural Center, again, welcome. This great place here. And let me back up for a second. Quite often, I am so passionate about diversity and what the University of Arkansas is doing. I almost had a Sarah Palin moment where I wanted to write some things on my hand. Well, I mean, quite honestly, we do community outreach, scholarship, and mentoring are three of the key things that we really focus on, and are really outreaching to the community to let them know what we want to focus on at the University of Arkansas. We try to enrich our culture, letting students know that this is a great place to learn. And through our programming, we are hopeful that students understand that the learning doesn't necessarily happen in the classroom. It also happens outside of the classroom. So I just want to welcome you, thank you, and please utilize the space and enjoy. All right, thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Chester Johnson here this afternoon. Chester has come back to the University of Arkansas this week to receive our Distinguished Alumni Award. Chester earned his undergraduate degree here in English, I might add. And after leaving Arkansas, Chester has gone on to have a long and distinguished career in finance. This is a poetry reading, so I won't go into all the details of that. But I will tell you that in addition to his business career, Chester has also miraculously managed to have a career in the arts, a career in poetry. After 9/11, Chester was named the World Trade Center Memorial Poet. His beautiful poem, St. Paul's Chapel, celebrates the Episcopal Chapel next to the World Trade Center that managed to survive the collapse of the Twin Towers. In Chester's poems, Elvis coexists with Mozart. Monticello, Arkansas lives comfortably with Manhattan. A word like huh, H-U-H, bumps up a few pages later against a word like Procrustean. These are poems of plain speak and verbal music, of erudition and common sense. They are learned poems, but they're also accessible poems. And most of all, they are deeply felt poems. In reading Chester's poetry, I never lose the sense that it grows out of a life lived, a life contemplated, and a life deeply loved. There is heat, a certain 98.6 degrees that radiates off every page. Please join me in welcoming back to the University of Arkansas, Chester Johnson.
Let me get situated here. By the way, thank you all for coming. I know everyone's very busy, and think about poetry at 3:30 in the afternoon when there's so much to get done. I know I really very much appreciate it. And obviously thank Davis so very much. I'm sure all of you know that Davis is a wonderful young poet whose work is already very much widely appreciated. I also want to thank Peggy Boyles for helping to make this poetry reading possible. She knew I was, as she said, most inclined to do this. I've read my verse at the other two institutions where I studied, Harvard University and the University of Arkansas at Monticello. I certainly desire to present my poetry here where I graduated. Thank you, Peggy. Since the circumstances surrounding this visit to the university by my wife Frida and me are so personal, involving my return here to accept an award, it would only be natural, in the spirit of the nature of the trip, for this poetry reading to focus on personal verse. Some critics say that all poetry, regardless of the topic, is personal. However, I've written historically centric poems, theoretical poems, imaginary poems, grammar-driven poems, structure-driven poems, but they won't be part of the group I'll read today. Rather, the poems to be read will be based on experiences I've had or felt that are reflected in the poems, or events that substantially impacted me in a very individual way. For example, as I contemplated over the last few months this time back to the university, a short quatrain I'd written kept repeating itself to me. When we are already worn and tried, steadfastly at peace, dismissing pride, we will instead, for a more private concern, recall these hours which we will yet relearn. That is the gift that this trip has given me, a moment to recall, and better still, to relearn distant hours. As I read various pieces this afternoon, I plan to interject here and there a quatrain I've written. I love quatrains. If you're familiar with my most recent book of verse, St. Paul's Chapel and Selected Shorter Poems, you'll note that there are two sections in the book devoted to quatrains and haiku. What can I say? I like short poems. When you can't say it in longer verse, you can frequently say it better in a very short poem. Someone asked me about behavior as a listener at the poetry reading. Well, I just request that if you have cause to hiss, try to muffle it a bit. I'm sensitive about that sort of thing. At the same time, if you happen to want to express approval at some of the verse, I'd ask you to wait, please, until the end, the very end of the readings. Thank you. All but one poem I'll read today are taken from my latest book of verse. Another little quatrain to get us started. Don't be so profound, you're not the last one found. To talk ever so serious makes one ever so delirious. Some 50 pounds heavier and some decades earlier, I was addicted to football. My self-image was reflected in the sport until my sophomore year in college when an injury ended it. The injury was one of the best things ever to happen to me. The name of this poem is Friday Nights on Hyatt Field. Most everyone who grew up in the South will recognize the irrefutable force of Friday night high school football. Friday nights on Hyatt Field. Someone kept Hyatt Field in shape where we knocked each other around. The Billies, very district champs, and I have the high school scars to prove it. Flair, or was it just flamboyance? A game, a roar, by football and public contact. Down into the grass we would grind our qualms and mangle the grinding by the other side as pain fell by demand into place. Hammer it out a yard at a time, the town prophet decreed by bark, and rolled us home bastards even further. A split lip for 1st and 10, a broken nose for 6 points more. We drove on surely to the sacrifice for a greater good of town and team. What tempest gods goading this pain do we gratify? By any name, there's nothing reverential, gasping at liquid air in an airless meadow among smells of athletic steam and grassy rows, a turf roughed by flesh-flaying cleats. There's nothing notional or subtle about it, not as a work in progress or thin, lithe strokes below the waist, not the glare from multi-eyed lights, band music and cacophony and cheers to keep the lead out, or a full stadium to make it worthwhile. Even a little blood left on the game can convince us we're heroes. The next poem I'll read is entitled Elegy to a Distant Son. For some reason, I guess it is in the destiny of so many families today, I'm frequently asked to recite this poem. We obviously live at a time when a not so unusual fare is for families to be fractured by divorce and for family members to be separated as though they were in the midst of a diaspora of war. As a personal comment, my relationship with my son has improved by multiples since this poem was composed and published. In fact, this verse is now one of his favorites. The poem is written in a terza rima form, consisting of a series of 3-line stanzas with interlocking rhyme scheme. While the form was apparently invented by Dante for the Divine Comedy, it was used by Shelley in Ode to the West Wind and employed by many recent poets. Elegy to a Distant Son. You will not know by any telling, son, the thoughts that I have softly shared with you. At once you weren't there. From divorce they run. And separate by place and unlike view, we cracked apart as though we were the rot. Myself for us was said to be untrue. You have your toys, mild talcums in low spot now at the ductile age of 24, and I have mine now long in tooth and squat. We share a little only, nothing more, while even on our way to fluent ground. What's done, these coupled traits we're to ignore. You trekked into another side around, another side of scrubs and pits unbound. We should forage by two to bear us best. But you have gods among brambles and trees, the gods you chose without my watchful test, around the deeper bush as I, by degrees, have learned to practice distance to survive. We quicken sports news, spun as similes, with pitchers, catchers, scores as points alive and hugs, for father-son things were denied from which a verbal coven could derive. And now from here, just simply put aside, for you'll do yours and I will go to mine, yet deep within the sleep of foster tide, and maybe on a day of law or sign, you will discover something we define. And maybe at the birth of any child, or moments moiling through the smoke of loss, or left behind a pair of fools self-styled, will shed from us this tumid albatross, before again it madly perseveres. What makes our mutual blood a double cross? And if the promise welcome back appears, we'd squinch badly for lines so meant to save, a flutter to both tongue and vow adheres to doubt reprised in restive words but brave. A safe distance opens a safe landscape. While musing on the slights that we forgave, I stalk your many secrets I'd reshape, and you're just moving faster to escape. The next quatrain I'll read was published by the New York Times at the height of the Clinton impeachment controversy. The quatrain appeared with an associated cartoon that had some shadowy character in the background secretly recording a conversation between Monica Lewinsky and Linda Tripp, who were having lunch within the cartoon. It's not one of my best, but it was of the moment. I used to say a lot before smarts I got. Now I say a lot less and get into less mess. In July 19 1990, there was a fatal accident on South Main Street in Monticello, Arkansas, right in front of a Piggly Wiggly grocery store. A speeding pickup truck hit an elderly woman who was crossing the street with an armful of groceries. Mercifully, she died only a few hours later. Someone could question why I use near newspaper-type phraseology in much of this poem. The facts surrounding a wreck like this carry more than enough emotional clarity on their own without my having to resort to an unnecessary load of language. You will obviously apprehend that this elderly woman has for me an extra gravity and pertinence. It's called The Wreck. Oh, by the way, my son's coming in tonight, so that's how if you're thinking back over the poem I read. The Wreck. It took 10 years to gather the nerve to write this poem. Shades on a mirror scare timid words away. It was like this. Opal toting groceries home after an extended trip to Phoenix as she crossed Main Street with an armful of nothing much. Now bear in mind, she was 80 years old and slight in size, very slight in size. Suddenly out of nowhere, a pickup truck, quicker than wind chill, barreled through the old woman, spotting her some 40 feet down the street before the two, tangled, came to rest. She whispered to the checkout girl who came to tend, "There isn't a place that doesn't hurt." Opal passed away, as many here paraphrase, of internal injuries 6 hours later, released from a resuscitator. It was like that. There are some things about which one cannot write till the shades fall from reflection and passage transforms her safely to the curb. A light quatrain would be appropriate at this point. Do things halfway. Don't forget to play, for completion imitates death, and conclusions stop a breath. Are y'all familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer? I'll give you a little bit of background on it. Davis got it at lunch in full force, like a fire hose, but I'll give a very short one. Dietrich Bonhoeffer became a well-known theologian and acclaimed writer while he was in his 20s during the rise of Hitler. Ironically employed as an agent of the German Military Intelligence Office, Bonhoeffer engaged in numerous anti-government activities that included supplying of assistance to Jews and creating a network both inside and outside of Germany of clergy and others who sought peace. Arrested in April 1943, Bonhoeffer remained in prison for the rest of his life. The Nazis were so obsessed with his death that they executed Bonhoeffer at the Flossenburg concentration camp located near the Czechoslovakian border only 2 weeks before American liberation of the camp. Stripped of clothing, tortured, and led naked to the gallows yard, he was then hanged from a tree. Bonhoeffer's final words to fellow prisoners conveyed an ultimate theological paradox. This is the end. For me, the beginning of life. All this before the age of 40. Over the last 2 years, I've written a drama in verse on Bonhoeffer. My wife says that he's been living at our apartment for 2 years, and she's sort of glad all of this is over. He can leave. But it's entitled For Conduct and Innocence. I'll read only I'll spend a few minutes reading excerpts from the piece. I'll read the drama's opening, the speaker being one of the voices of the condemned that are used extensively throughout the work. In addition, I'll read the first page of the drama. Richard N. is a role representing a collage of Bonhoeffer's friends and associates. Gertrude, Bonhoeffer's fiancée. I'll also read a part for Bonhoeffer. The drama is this drama in verse is written in a form I call elastic rhyme. If you're interested, after the reading, you can come up. I've sort of described it here, and you pick up a sheet that'll go into exactly what is entailed with elastic rhyme. Opening, Voice of the Condemned, 659-537. Small amounts of love contain a modest gift, but the larger parts of love speak prophecy. After all, we know that nothing gains quite without mystery, closely unbound and untamed. The thoughts to convey, the unfurling effects of mystery. We're daily solving to replay in our own peculiar way the undisclosed lure of unexplained times. But here, all order lies in an irreverent claim that we'll win some fake charm for a magical ride where many now think safety began. As blunt, desperate attempts to mock crudely the mystery again gather, as a wayward excuse to justify the too narrow forms, as the man gods, once loose, start to work miracles to induce our desire to be remade. And here, enough safe logic rounds to murder with ease and texture. And now, inhumane, the quicker so many trivialize the unknown and unknowable. Act 1 begins in September 1940. This drama verse covers 3 years leading up to his arrest. Richard N. Blame the cold, for it takes the winter's loss better than we can in our short and loosely controlled wit, tolerating these regrettable times. Our own first rules turning aside and in blood mutating into those outside approved decrees, transgressions laying claim to what appears normal, flood to fill an empty and grim face. Then begins a dialogue surrounding a clergy friend who had just been arrested. Dietrich. The sentenced, Brother K., more excessive, searched for his life again, seeing his death as the last best chore as the freedom to live. So he waited just to be caught as a victim who doesn't command an alternative. The fiancée Gertrude speaks. Still, I can understand a man who falls easily. The desire to contain this life in a context or brand becomes too haunting. Both fate and death, equal weights of the end. Their bodies creak, they were so right. No one dares stop them as it should last like a minor bleak burst, or to be laid aside and only a lost time left. And he was taken away first, not like a blasphemed thug, and of course he would return after the mild phase of taunt hysteria ran down. Dietrich speaks once again. Then he had, above trite plays, never supposed to vie in absurdity, as his blinking smile reflected a larger laugh inside a higher view. To consider a moment unhinged of lonely principle, not in a little while he would be undone by the tracks of a false country. He called my ways too serious, that I don't rely on others while I yearn. You take them like a free lunch, and you're always full of conditions for your own sake, even without working at it. Since you try that little game to be perfect, there's no doubt you've then learned no trick to keep from loving yourself mostly and the nature of your own thoughts, too steep for general use. I'll skip over 50 pages of the drama to the final page of the final scene, the moment before Bonhoeffer's arrest at his parents' home in Berlin. Another voice of the condemned makes a comment about the exploding bombs nearby from Allied planes, and then Dietrich recites a monologue that supplies a clear echo, for those who are familiar with this sort of thing, supplies a clear echo from the Gospel of John 21. Voice of the Condemned, 348, 127. Within view of the actual, we're publicly more afraid with each thunder of loose bombs, combing and darting so near the zone of panic. We fought closer there for every life than these remitted winners who hunt us, these neighbors favored by air without voices to explain. And then Dietrich ends the drama with these lines. They step loudly, steps ricocheting against the center, vital part of an inviting heart, pulse momentarily convinced. I feel no drift waiting to be struck by loud purpose once again. Do not stop them. The swift fever must have a chance to expire, though consumptive fire purges all. I sense the heat of torment advance close now. Let it follow one intended course. At last, let my pain wash entirely in weakness. I hear martial extended sounds. Unlock the doors. Free the house, this den of cold resistance. Freedom comes. Don't wait for one more knock. Open the house, open the doors. Do you love me? Then don't deny them this slaughterhouse. So do you love me? Then lead them by access. Do you love me? Do not refuse them. Do you love me? Feed them. I mentioned earlier that the poems I'll read today are personal vintage. As one ages and the effects on the body become more obvious, then the body itself and its immutable adjustments of all kinds, delays, stutters, surprises, occupy increasing attention. Thus a good reason for the next poem, Another Sultry Moment. Flesh is the thing. Sere, rough-hewn leather says we've gotten old and baroque. Fruit-flavored and spot-free, suppleness tells a much different story. We knew the latter once, when sap rose daily, nightly, continually, not deciduously, no seasonal to seasonal preservation, no waiting upon a lambent pulse. Flesh was the thing. Now sap clogs on its way, slow to surface on the parched high of thinner skin, and yet we've learned the tricks of trading guile for unction and grit for sauce. Wizened in a grasp of sentient claims, flesh is still the thing. I started smiling because I just remembered something about 2 or 3 years ago. I was asked to speak at a suburban church outside of Philadelphia and read some of my verse. And so I read my verse as part of the sermon. And I often will run what I'm going to say by Frida before she's a great barometer, and she steers me always in the right direction. And this time I didn't. And so I don't know how you felt. I felt it was okay to read this Another Sultry Moment. And so after I gave the poetry reading, which was actually a sermon, and I'd finished with Another Sultry Moment, flesh is the thing, whether I go to the pew and Frida looks at me, she's blanched, she says, "My God, what were you thinking of?" And then after we had a discussion with the priest, and he said, "Well, maybe you should have run it by." So anyway, the following quatrain contributes to this theme. So you like the contours of time, counting seconds and minutes in rhyme. To grow older, you say, means a loss of power, for you expect less from each passing hour. Frida and I were in Paris. One night, from jet lag, that extra glass of wine, or from some disagreeable food, I simply couldn't sleep. A rarity. I often nod off in the middle of my own sentences. So I walked. At about 3 a.m., I found myself in front of a school on Rue de Rosier. A plaque hanging near the playground, near the courtyard, read, to quote, 165 Jewish children from this school were deported by Germany during the Second World War and were exterminated in the Nazi camps. Never forget. The poem, School on Rue de Rosier. To lament is to warn. No slaughterhouse of innocence can be explained so. A cosmic loss can only be reached by a cosmic soul. What merciful eye forgot to look their way? Sums of laughter are disguised by honor and drama tonight. Only a plaque remains to remind me children once resided where echoes now control. What merciful eye forgot to look their way? How can crimes and insanity be so near so many among balance and delight? I know and do not know, for fear of the answer keeps me timid. So be it. Monuments and plaques to commemorate our failures, not our heroes. This morning I hear a baby cry above Rue de Rosier, suggesting once again I yet turn away the fortunes and recourses of loss and the designs and progress of pain. What merciful eye forgot to look their way? The morning light now rises above the school on Rue de Rosier, and soon the chatter of children will again rule a courtyard. Music will be heard, and a boy will not notice one girl predicts and surveys her own absence. To lament is to warn. Let those who play here now know without despair or numbness that great accidents befall great people. Great evil befalls great good, and the greatest fall always dances near the greatest dancer. The next two poems are not personal in the sense of being event-driven like most of the ones I've read. Rather, the next two involve the exploration of personal views on a couple of highlighted subjects. Genesis conveys a simple point. Oh, by the way, I only have about 3 or 4 more poems, and if anyone has any questions, I'll take them after that. But Genesis conveys a simple point. It conveys the essence of innocence moving inevitably toward contact with a world outside a Garden of Eden. Genesis. The nature of things, water that moves, the bread of oxygen, such. Before the latent loss has taken root and blooms, is first naive, then harmed. The second in this vein of personal views without event is titled The Other. Yes, there's something that causes fascination with the notion of celebrity. While most of us do not prefer it for ourselves, nevertheless there can be something fleetingly or not so fleetingly seductive about it. I played with the idea in this poem, how it's not wanted but once had, it's hard to let go. The other. I whispered heresy. Be small and thankful you're not popular, for you don't need to recall sales, nor nod at a vendor, nor pretend not to see. They look lost there, with scrupulous grins and an entourage extruding faith and contrast. Sure, you envy their teeth, but not the gross claims they must eat for breakfast. Yet once popular, you'd hardly be unpopular soon. The next one is a little different. I looked at myself in a broken window, several shards at different angles and at different depths. My individual reflection was askew in different ways each time I shifted from place to place in front of this broken glass, one way and then another. The eerie effect of a doppelganger absorbed my attention, the ghostly counterpart of a living person, that person being me, my face cut into various angles, often in a vacant space. So this poem, Doppelganger, Reflections at a Broken Window, as follows. I am I, and no one else, surprisingly at an angle. I'd be someone else, really, but I'm hampered by in between. For other folds and joints don't match, or I lay overheated or submerged under ice to wet fog over glass. I am I, and no one else. but I can't smug it out there worrying away between a half I have and the half to someone else. A love poem never needs an introduction or shouldn't. The earth shook, went bad, and came round again. We caught an evening sky and put all disturbed objects and crooked things back together. And the earth coalesced around our love and slipped back into a smooth slumber. Another quatrain of relevance. Do not stop short or choose to thwart. Something has to have length if it plans to have strength. This is the second marriage for both Frida and me. The attitudes and presumptions that came to the second marriage were discernibly at odds with those for a first marriage. Our own special flaws and our recognition of them ironically turn into special gifts this second time. Patience, the elimination of preconditions, the absence of torture caused by untried naivete, all are wonderfully available to the second time around, at least for us. The marriage. Now we reach the point of commitment, a stone on the ground, niche in the history of our condition, a word across centuries of casual disavowal. We do exist and choose. A marriage day comes for everyone, conjugation of a propelling and allegoric trust, one throw across a precipice, code for past failures. After a hostile assault on ideals we have maintained has fallen in turn limp and stale, our loss now unretained. Marriage lays a line across lines of twilight, perhaps without amendment in sight. I would like to end today's readings with September the 11th and September the 12th poems. Frida and I worked for years downtown in New York City until 9/11. Our offices were close to the point of contact when the twin towers of the World Trade Center were attacked. And the debris and jet fuel that came through the vent and air circulation system destroyed our offices. Yet we were fortunate indeed, of course, on many counts. I call these the September the 11th and September 12th poems. Before St. Paul's Chapel, the September 12th poem, there is necessarily the antecedent September the 11th poem, which is entitled Fear of Flying. In theological terms, there must be a Good Friday before there's an Easter. Fear of flying. We're downtown on September the 11th, minding our business, tending fate. There's one moment early in advance of the rest when birds don't sing being in flight, when they wind alongside many a parched cornice. No, they never sing without a grip, and we want to be with God. Around the corner, across from St. Paul's Chapel, people take on air. Some leap, while most degrade into vapor in one giant cough, dropping headlong through flames or debris, never landing. God, save them and us. Wait. We aerate effect to lighten the torque. Balloons, yes, balloons and footballs, kites, all fly so high a loose languor, as if ordained aloft in undiminishable space, retiring into well-stretched and elevated hands. God meant for rare things to happen, but not for a man with a butcher knife to cut an airborne tether. By hell's unchoked wretch, a gas-blackened plume heatedly swells a swatch of cellophane heavenward, higher still. How does it happen some things rise air-tucked without ties, staves, or other fast catch-me's? Atop an attenuating breath, the swath should land, but when? Wisdom comes once we've taken place. So there, flying is good for business, we're told, but is it good for us? Before I read September 12th poem, a minute about St. Paul's Chapel. I have to do this every time, so just bear with me. I have to tell you about the chapel because it's a wonderful place. The chapel is located directly across from the site of the World Trade Center. On 9/11, when so many buildings next to or across from the towers were destroyed or severely damaged, there was not a window broken or stone dislodged at St. Paul's Chapel. And out of the dust, the chapel took its place as the 24/7 relief center for the recovery workers at Ground Zero. I volunteered there nights during the cleanup. The chapel served as a special sanctuary for grief, memory, and renewal. Immediately on its fences were memorabilia about those who were missing. The memorabilia had to be modified within days to become letters to and pictures of the dead, prayers, poems, pieces of commemorative clothing. Volunteers from all over the country, I know from here too, came to help at St. Paul's during the succeeding 8 months of cleanup. Now it is a place of pilgrimage, and the signature poem from my most recent book of poetry, St. Paul's Chapel, is on display there and is also printed as the memento card given to the 20,000 to 30,000 pilgrims and visitors who are there weekly. I've met so many at the chapel over the years, including students from this university, who want to experience the pilgrimage to St. Paul's Chapel. This poem is simply St. Paul's Chapel. It stood, not a window broken, not a stone dislodged. It stood when nothing else did. It stood when terrorists brought September down. It stood among myths. It stood among ruins. To stand was its purpose. Long lines prove that. It stands, and around it now a shrine of letters, poems, acrostics, litter of the heart. It is the standing people want, to grieve, serve, and tend, celebrate the lasting stone of St. Paul's Chapel. Deep into its thick breath, the largest banner, fittingly from Oklahoma, climbs heavenward with hands as stars, hands as stripes, hands as a flag, and a rescuer reaches for a stuffed toy to collect a touch. And George Washington's pew doesn't go unused. Charity fills a hole or two. It stood in place of other sorts. It stood when nothing else could. The great had fallen as the brute hardware came down. It stood. Thank you. And if you have any questions. Any questions? Yes.
Did you write poetry while you were at the University of Arkansas?
Oh, yes. I started writing poetry when I was in high school, and I kept writing through. But it was through my college years. But I really started to really focus on it when I was about 23, 24, soon after college. But I definitely wrote. And I was associated at that time. The university didn't.
Yeah, if you speak in front of the podium.
Oh, sorry.
Be better.
Right. No problem. Thank you. At that time, the creative writing department really wasn't rolling through in the 66, 68. Whitehead was here, whoever was Whitehead, and Harrison was here, and Miller Williams had not come yet. I think he came in the early 70s. I believe that's right, and I was gone at that time. But there was the beginnings of really focus on the spoken word as an important priority here at the University of Arkansas. And I mean, it's come so far. I mean, creative writing department's one of the top 5 in the country, so it's come along. But mine was really more ad hoc during that time. I was sort of working my way through it. Any other? Yeah.
So how do you find time within your busy, regular business life to take the time to do this creative writing?
Well, there are 2 or 3 things. One is that Frida and I work together in business. I mean, we have a small consulting firm that advises states, local governments, authorities on raising money. I mean, in terms of selling bonds. We don't buy and sell, but we advise them on that. So we spend all day together. So at night, we don't necessarily have to say each other, how was your day, honey? Because we know sort of what. And so, and Frida's very active in numerous organizations, and particularly in one where it takes her, she's out frequently at night. So I work on my poetry at night, and also the weekends I really spend, and I'm pretty disciplined about it. The weekends are generally all day Saturday, and then some of the afternoon on Sunday and Sunday night. But I think you would, and no vacations. That was one thing when we got married. She was used to vacations, and she married me, and we don't have vacations. So, she always mentions that. This is Frida, if no one knows that. You haven't been able to tell. Any other questions? Thank you again for coming. Appreciate it. And if you're interested in elastic rhyme, feel free.